So let's get started. Welcome everyone. Hopefully we have a few people who were here last week when we talked a little bit about the new thinking skills section. Today we're going to cover two more sections in the exam, those that have been the most changed. We're going to talk a little bit about the reading and the writing section. So we're going to focus primarily on the reading section. That's the section that has undergone the most changes. And then at the end, we're going to talk very briefly about the writing section. Now, for those of you who know me already, hello, welcome back. I hope you'll get a lot out of this particular workshop. But for those of you who don't, I will quickly introduce myself. My name is Chewy Wang. I'm one of the founders and a tutor here at Cogito Tutoring. And I'm a current law student at the University of Sydney. I'm in my 4th year, which means I will graduate hopefully at the end of 2 years from now. And I have done a lot of debating. I studied philosophy for my arts degree. So I've analyzed today the new sections that have been added. What we're going to do, or what we're going to focus on today, is primarily what has changed as opposed to the old selective exams. What sorts of questions will you be asked to do in the reading and writing section? And what are some strategies to approach these new questions to make sure that we don't panic and we do a good job? Now, for all the parents here, as well as the children attending, I would recommend that you start writing some notes. So the best way I think that you take some notes is to get out a pen and a piece of paper. There's nothing better than actually writing yourself, because scientifically proven that when you write things down, it puts it into your memory a little bit more. So if you could take a little bit of time to get that out now, or of course, if you're feeling a little bit lazy, you can always take a photo if you want to. But I highly recommend writing things down, because then you translate what I'm about to say into something that you understand and that you'll be able to revise as you get closer to the selective schools exam early next year. Now, today's workshop will primarily be focusing on the exam that has been released by the New South Wales government. Recently, the New South Wales government released a sample exam for every single section. Last week, we covered the thinking skills section. Today, we're going to be covering the reading and writing sections. We're going to be looking at what we can learn from the sample exam and what we can look forward to early next year. So let's get started then with the biggest section, or the one that you're going to probably do first in the exam, the reading section. So before we start looking at it, how has the reading section changed? The first thing we need to understand about the reading section is very simple. The reading section in some ways has gotten easier, and in other ways it has gotten a little bit harder. Now, in what ways has it gotten easier? As you'll notice, for those of you who have done the reading section already, there are 30 questions in the reading section, but you have 40 minutes. That is actually quite a lot of time to do only 30 reading comprehension questions. In the previous exam, there were more questions and more time pressure. But for this new exam, they're not really testing you in the reading section on your ability to read fast. Instead, they're testing you on other things. And in many ways, the reading section has actually become quite similar to the thinking skills section, because it requires you to be quite creative and flexible with how you attempt the questions and how you read the texts. So what we're going to do today is walk through the 4 main types of ways they're going to be testing you. Luckily, some of them have changed, some of them have stayed the same. Now, you can breathe a sigh of relief, because in my opinion, after doing a little bit of analysis, the difficulty and the quality of the passages are the same. So what I mean by that is the texts themselves, the difficulty of the writing, has not necessarily gotten much harder. So many of the poetry that you'll be reading and some of the prose texts you'll be reading are largely similar in difficulty to what you were doing before, or perhaps some of the practice you've done in past years. However, what has gotten a little bit harder, or maybe not harder, but at least different, is the way that these texts are being tested. No longer do you just have one type of reading comprehension test where it's a passage at the top and then 6 or 7 questions. Put up your hand if you know what I'm talking about. The classic reading comprehension, it's just a passage, and then afterwards you have 6 or 7, maybe 8 questions, all about that particular passage. Now, that's how it's been for several years. That has fundamentally changed. There are still, maybe, possibly, some texts like that, but the large majority will take on a different form. However, this is no reason to panic. We're going to walk through some of the strategies on how to solve these new types of questions in today's workshop. Now, as you've noted here, I said that they are more comparative and dynamic ways of testing the passages. The main difference between the old reading section and the new reading section is that the prose text, so prose means not poetry. Everyone know, put up your hand if you know the difference between poetry and prose. Prose is like regular writing. It's about facts. It's factual writing. And poetry is poetry. Everyone knows what poetry is like. But the prose text passages are more comparative. So what you're going to get is several prose passages as part of one set of questions. You might have two, sometimes you might even have 4 passages. And then you'll be asked questions about comparing them and in different ways. We're going to be talking about how we might do that today. So really, the only new challenge for the reading section is handling these new ways of reading the text. So we have to become used to them and we have to know the best strategy of tackling them. So it's more about problem solving than it is about mere comprehension. And like I said at the start, you can breathe a sigh of relief. In my opinion, it's not necessarily a more difficult exam. It is just testing your brain in different ways. However, before we continue, I must take a note, and this is something you must note very carefully. The new reading exam requires you to be extremely accurate. That's one difference. The reason for this is twofold. One, because there's only 30 questions, and of course, everyone knows the selective scores is a ranked exam. So it doesn't matter how much you get. It's all about how you compare to other people in the state. Because it's a ranked exam, you must make sure you get as close to 30 out of 30 as possible. Because there are less questions, the cost of making a mistake is higher. Therefore, we need to be more accurate. But second of all, we need to be more accurate because there are certain question types in this new reading section where if you get one question wrong, it causes a butterfly effect and you might get several other questions wrong as part of that set of questions as well. Now, put up your hand if you know what I mean by butterfly effect, okay? It's the myth that, a butterfly flapping its wings might cause a tornado somewhere else in the world. Well, it's not that dramatic, it's not that extreme, but you may cause errors in other places. So we have to be extremely careful. And I'm going to give you some tips about how we can improve our accuracy as part of the new reading section. So let's move on and have a look at what types of questions the new reading section has introduced. So firstly, let's talk about 3 main tips. 3 main tips to approaching the new reading section. 1, 2, and 3. All 3 are equally as important, but let's talk about why these are important and how we might use them before we get into the nitty-gritty and we start talking about specifically what we might do for each type of question. Now, more than ever before, it is extremely important before you start reading to skim read all the questions first. Put up your hand if you know what I mean by skim read. It means to very quickly look through the questions and see what they're about. Now, the reason you have to skim read the questions first is the comprehension section is no longer one text, one set of questions. You might have 2 texts, 4 texts, and a set of questions that doesn't necessarily pertain to one specific text. Therefore, you must have a look at all the questions very quickly first. Pay attention to what sorts of comparisons they're asking you to make. Now, for example, we're going to be looking at a comparative reading section later where you have 2 texts, A and B. Look at the questions first and ask yourself, hang on a second, how are they making me compare A and B? What do I need to pay attention to in A and B? Which one is more accurate, A or B? These are the questions you need to be asking yourself as you skim read the questions first. Number 2, because the reading section has changed, and this will become clearer, so don't feel confused yet if you don't understand exactly what I'm talking about for tip number 2, but you should try to incorporate thinking skills strategies. So lots of the strategies that you used in the thinking skills section, for example, logical reasoning, choosing the answers that you're sure of first and then filtering out the ones that are wrong, those you must start to apply in the reading section, because the reading section will test you in new ways that has never been tested before. Not necessarily harder, just different. And they will require you to think very logically and very accurately. So that's why we need to incorporate some thinking skills strategies. So we're going to talk about what that means a little bit later. And finally, tip number 3 is one part of the new reading section that's a little bit annoying, is that several of the answers might be sort of slightly correct. However, it's your job to pick out the best fit. It's no longer okay just to pick out an answer that seems, maybe a little bit right. You have to pick out the one that is the most right. So therefore, you need to be very careful. So the main takeaway from all three of these is the new reading section, you don't have much time pressure because it's 30 questions in 40 minutes, which means you have more than a whole minute to do each question. And as we'll see later, you can do some of the questions quite fast, but you cannot rush. Just because you don't have time pressure means you shouldn't rush. You should be very accurate with your reading. All right, now let's move on to looking at the 4 main types of ways they're going to get you to read the texts. These are the 4 categories of questions that we've identified in the New South Wales government's recent sample exam. Now, don't worry, you don't have to write a lot here, so don't worry about scribbling all of this down now. So take a break because we're going to be diving into each of these in much more detail. This is just a broad overview of the content we're going to be covering today. Now, one of the types of questions that we haven't seen before is the comparative reading section. Now, the comparative reading section is a type of question where there's going to be 2 prose texts. Remember, prose is just regular writing, it's not poetry, followed by regular questions which may be about either or both. So what that means is there might be a question that says in A, and then it might be a question. In B, there might be a question. But crucially, what's different from this exam as opposed to past exams is they might ask you questions about both A and B. So they might say something like, which of A and B is the most accurate about, I don't know, airplanes or something, right? Let's say the articles are about airplanes. So it will require you to compare the 2 texts, which is a skill that hasn't really been done in the reading section before. But luckily, it's not very difficult. You just have to be accurate. The second type is the type that you should all be used to, reading comprehension. It's the most classic type. What that is it's one text followed by a series of questions about that text. So this is just normal. You've done reading comprehension before. Some of you have been doing it for several years now. However, what is a little bit strange is that it appears that the simple reading comprehension style, where you have one text and a few questions about that text, is only for poetry texts. Now, I know some of you struggle a little bit with poetry or find poetry hard. We're going to talk about poetry a little bit later on and some tips of tackling poetry. The third type of question, which they've introduced, and this is the riskiest one. Okay, note that, and we're going to get into why it's risky a little bit later, so don't worry about scribbling all of this down now. The third type of question is the fill in the blank type question. This is where there's going to be a single prose text. Remember, prose is just like a regular article, and there's going to be multiple blanks throughout. Okay, there are going to be parts that are missing from each paragraph. Then you will have a number of sentences labeled A through to E, or maybe sometimes even F or G, and you have to fill in the blank. Which sentence goes where in this prose text? And that's going to be a little bit of a risky question because that question can cause a really bad butterfly effect. If everyone remembers what I was talking about just a few minutes ago, the butterfly effect. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to avoid the butterfly effect in the fill in the blank section. The final and fourth type of passage is called the passage identification. And this is actually quite easy. It's not difficult, but once again, like everything else in this new reading section, it requires you to be very careful and very accurate. So what the passage identification section is you'll have up to 4 prose texts, and they're usually very short, only a few paragraphs long, followed by a series of statements about any of those 4 texts. Then you have to identify which one, 1, 2, 3, or 4, A, B, C, or D, of the 4 prose texts best matches that particular statement. Don't worry about if this seems very complex or abstract. We're going to be taking a look at practice examples for each type where I'll be walking you through how to tackle them. So if everyone's ready, let's move on to the first category, the comparative reading section. Ooh, the text is a little bit squashed here, but that's okay. The first section is the comparative reading type. Now, this is only a slight twist on regular reading comprehension passages? Once again, put up your hand if you know what I'm talking about when I say regular reading comprehension. Text on top, 6 or 7 questions down the bottom. Now, this is only a slight twist. How is it a slight twist? You will instead not be provided 1, but 2 passages, A and B, on same or similar topics. So they'll usually be about very similar things. So they might both be about airplanes or dogs or holidays or something like that. They'll both be on the same topic. But crucially, the questions will ask you about either one of the 2 texts or both texts at the same time. When they ask you about one of the 2 texts, it's actually just like a regular comprehension section. All right, you read the text and you answer the question. Very, very simple. However, when they ask you about both of the texts at the same time, has anyone here seen a Venn diagram before? This thing on the right? Put up your hand if you've seen a Venn diagram before. Now, when they ask you about questions on the right, okay, like the Venn diagram on the right, you will have to maybe compare and contrast the 2 texts in some way. So they might ask you what is similar about the 2 texts. They might ask you what is different about the 2 texts. Or they might ask you which one of these texts says this. So you're going to have to compare and contrast the 2 texts in some way. And that's not really been done before. Now, the key area that some people might get confused about when it comes to the comparative reading passages is that they might get confused about exactly which text is being questioned. Now, remember, if the question asks you specifically about A, you should only look at A. Don't use the information in B to inform your answer in A. And that's how some of the examiners will try to trick you. Does everyone see how that works? They might add an extra detail in B that says something about the question. But if they ask you specifically in extract A, you should only look at extract A, and vice versa for extract B as well. Do not get tricked by the person who wrote the question. Only when they ask you about both texts at the same time, and it will be clear in the question if they're asking about both texts at the same time, can you draw details from both texts. So be careful not to get tricked. The reason is sometimes they might give you a passage which is for something. For example, why school uniform should be banned. And extract B might be why school uniform shouldn't be banned. So if you try to answer one of the questions about extract A, but you accidentally use some details from extract B, you might get the question completely wrong. Now, here's where I'm going to introduce an idea that is going to help us all throughout the rest of the reading section. So note this very clearly, especially the parents and the kids who are listening. One of the ways that we can make the test easier is if we do the questions a little bit out of order. Now that sounds very scary, right? You should never really do the questions out of order. Why? Because, and I'm sure those of you who can speak Chinese will know what I mean, you might be prone to making 出心 errors, okay? So you might make errors that are a bit silly, right? You might ignore something, you might count the wrong number of answers, and you get it all wrong. But the best way to complete some of the things in the reading sections are to do them a little bit out of order. So the best way to do the reading section is, if everyone has a copy of the exam in front of them or seen the copy before, does everyone know how, for example, in each question, you get a reading paper? Everyone see this reading paper? You don't have to look at it in detail, but there will be questions listed like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Now, the best way to do this is to do them out of order, but before you fill in the little bubbles, because you'll have an answer sheet where you have to color in a bubble, circle the answers here first. And that way you won't get them out of order. So do it in pencil here first. And once you complete an entire passage, then fill in the answers. Does everyone understand that strategy? Now, the reason why we do the questions out of order is sometimes it makes it much, much easier to answer the set of questions as a whole. This is what I meant by using thinking skills strategies. When we do them out of order, it helps us answer the questions by making things clearer. Now, why should we do comparative reading sections not 1 through to 10, but maybe we'll do 4, 5, 6 first, and then 3, 4, 5, and then maybe get to the other questions later? The reason for this is you should always try to do the questions which are asking you about a specific text first. So do the questions that are only about A and the questions that are only about B, and save the questions that are both about A and B to the last. Now, why should we do that? When you do the questions that are specifically about A or B first, your brain gets a much better idea of what A and B are about. If you start with the questions that are about both A and B, you don't really know what A or B are about yet. You've only read them once. But when you do 3 or 4 questions specifically about A or about B, then your brain knows, okay, this is what the passage is about, and it makes comparing and contrasting them a lot easier. Does that make sense to everyone? Like I said, in the comparative reading section, there'll be questions about a specific text and a question about both texts. Do the ones about specific text first, circle them in with pencil on your exam paper, and then finally, when you've completed the whole section, fill them all out in a row. That's by far the best way to do it, because you don't make silly errors and you use a good strategy of completing the exam. So let's take a look at an example from the sample exam that has been released by the New South Wales government, which you can find online by Googling New South Wales Selective School sample paper. So here is a practice example, question 7 from the paper. Now, question 7, how does the writer in extract B feel when the roller coaster comes into view? Here, can everyone see how this question is asking you specifically about extract B? Does everyone see that? It asks you specifically, how does the writer in extract B feel? It doesn't ask in which extract. It doesn't ask which of the extracts. It simply asks, how does the writer in extract B feel? So remember one of the tips that we just talked about? When it asks you specifically about one of the extracts, you only look at that extract. You only look at extract B. So if it asks you specifically about extract B, here I've taken a screenshot of where the evidence for this question might be. Have a look, everyone, where the evidence for the question might be. Here on the screenshot on the right are the final 2 paragraphs of extract B. Now take 1 minute to read the extract, and then when you think you have a bit of an answer, we'll continue. So have a look at extract B now on the right. Obviously, it's much better if you have a copy of this in front of you, but it's okay if you don't, because I've included some of the extracts here. Okay, let's analyze this question and figure out the answer. So because the question asks you specifically about extract B, we're only looking at extract B. And here's where I think the evidence for this answer is. Now let's look at this passage together. Now this first paragraph maybe isn't that relevant. Remember, it's about the roller coaster coming into view. And it seems like this first paragraph is about driving to the Gold Coast. So probably not, the evidence is probably not in that particular paragraph. But let's look at this last paragraph. On the day of the trip, we'd wake before sunrise in order to get there by opening time. Despite the 3 hours of pain we'd endured, we'd feel an overwhelming sense of wonder as the Thunderbolt, Dreamworld's roller coaster, painted with flames, emerged from the trees that bordered the Pacific Highway. It would appear so suddenly, like a strange apparition or a mirage. We would crane our necks back, trying to take in the sheer majesty of it. Now let's look at the 4 answers. How does the writer feel in extract B, which is where this is from, when the roller coaster comes into view? Now, does it sound like they're really scared? So probably not, right? They're not terrified. They're not like, oh my God, a roller coaster, we have to run away. Okay, that's probably not it. Are they relieved? They're like, oh, a roller coaster, I'm so confident. Okay, B is probably not right as well, right? They're not relieved. Are they bewildered? Are they like, huh? Is that a roller coaster? I don't really know. I've never seen a roller coaster before. Obviously not as well. Now, awestruck seems like the most appropriate answer here, because awestruck means amazed, okay? Filled with wonder, filled with imagination. And here we see it would appear so suddenly like a strange apparition or a mirage, and it filled them with an overwhelming sense of wonder. Awestruck appears to be the most appropriate response. So the answer here would be D. Now, what is a mistake that someone can make? they might accidentally look at extract A, which is about camping, which is something totally different, okay? It's about driving down and camping. If they read about driving down and camping, trust me, they're not going to get the right answer for this one. They're going to feel very confused. So we must pay attention to which passage it's asking us to analyze. Let's look at practice example 2, which is about both texts. Now, in practice example 2, okay, it asks you, in which extracts do the people dislike spending time in natural surroundings? Now, unfortunately, I can't attach the entire text here because both of them are very long, but hopefully you've had a little bit of a read before the workshop so you know what the questions I'm talking about are. But why is it important for us to do questions like this after we do the questions about the specific passages? Does anyone recall? It's because once we do the questions like this one that we just did, okay, for question 3, once we do questions like this one that we just did, we have a good idea of what extract B is about. And now there are other questions specifically about extract A as well. Then when we go back to question 3, which is a question about both extracts, we can answer it quite easily. We don't have to waste time going back and rereading both extracts again and again to figure out, oh, which one is more about the one who dislikes spending time in natural surroundings. Does that make sense? If we do them a little bit out of order, we save ourselves some time and we increase our accuracy. Because at that point, our brains are already familiar with the main themes of both texts, which means this question should be quite easy. Now, if we have a look at extract A, which I haven't attached here, and by the time you've done all the questions specific about extract A, it seems like the person in extract A really likes going outside, right? It's about spending times with horses and looking at all the trees and stuff like that. But what does extract B say? Literally in the first passage, my family isn't the outdoors type. Oh, okay. Well, that seems pretty clear then, right? It seems pretty clear that only one of the extracts is about people who dislike spending time in natural surroundings. Now, if you did this in the order that the questions were written, 1, 2, 3 first, you might spend a lot of time rereading both texts to figure it out. But if you do them out of order, you don't need to waste that sort of time because in your head, you should already be clear, okay, I have a pretty good idea. You only have to do a little quick check. So this is one way we can increase our accuracy as well as decreasing the amount of time we waste time. So of course, the answer to this question, in which extracts do the people dislike spending time in their natural surroundings, is of course B. Extract B is the only one about that. Okay, let's carry on to the second type of question. Oh, the second type of question is your regular reading comprehension styled question. Now, it's regular because there's only going to be one text followed by a set of questions about that text. So it's very simple in that way because it's something you should already be used to. Does that make sense to everyone? You should already be familiar. It should already make sense to you. However, it seems from the practice exam that was released by the government that they're only keeping this type of text to test poetry. Now, poetry, maybe some of you hear the word poetry and you get a shiver down your spine and you say, I hate poetry. I don't like it. I don't understand it. Maybe that's what you are. But that's okay. I know lots of people struggle with poetry, but poetry, we have to look at a little bit differently. Now, I've included this little bit of a funny diagram. It's not really necessarily meant to be taken as law, but the way we read poetry is very different from the way we read regular articles and extracts. Regular articles and extracts, you're expected to read it and take out information. Okay, so if we see this diagram on the right, we take out information. We find facts, we find opinions, things like that. That's the takeaway from a regular article. But poetry is a little bit different. Poetry is all about imagery and emotions. It's not about finding specific correct pieces of information and facts. It's about the emotions. So the way you're meant to read poetry is you must be more open-minded. Don't be reading poetry as if it's like an article, as if you're looking for facts. You need to concentrate on what images the poetry creates in your mind and what sorts of feelings and moods it evokes. Because lots of the questions are going to be about that. They might ask you something like, what mood does this stanza create? Everyone knows what a stanza or a line is, right? They're like little paragraphs in poems, okay? They might ask you like, oh, in the final line of the poem, what tone has the author used? These are questions where you're not going to find facts in the poem. The poem is not going to say, I, the poet, used a very nostalgic mood in the final line, right? That's absurd. A poem's never going to tell you that like an article is going to tell you that. An article is going to say, dolphins are sea creatures, full stop. And one of the questions might be, what types of creatures are dolphins? And then you obviously circle sea. A poem is not going to tell you that. A poem is more about the imagery and the moods and the emotions it creates. So that's what you need to focus on. Now, although you can't read a poetry aloud in an exam, and I do not recommend that, it would be very funny if in the middle of the hall you started reading your poem out loud to yourself, because I think everyone around you would hate you. Don't do that. You can still try to read it aloud in your head. Okay, that's the best way of creating imagery and focusing on the imagery. Read it aloud in your inner voice. Read through the poem. Now, many students struggle with poetry and getting the right answer to poetry because they're looking for the facts. They're looking as if there's going to be a right answer in this one sentence, but that's not the way you approach poetry. You have to focus on the images and the emotions. Now, put up your hand if you know about poetic techniques, or some of you do already. Things like similes and metaphors and personification. Now, I find that lots of students already know about all of these techniques, but even though they know about techniques, they don't know what to do with them. Now, the key when you spot a technique in a poem is ask yourself, what is the meaning of this technique? Why has the poet used a simile here? What effect does it have on me? Does it create a new type of image in my head? Does it make me feel a certain way? That is how we're meant to read poetry. Remember, not like an article where you're looking for the facts, but you're thinking about it in terms of mood and imagery. Does everyone understand the key difference between poems and prose texts? Remember, you're never going to find maybe the specific right answer in a poem like you can find in a prose text. You have to interpret it and be creative. So let's look at one of the hardest questions from this sample exam. So here is the start of the poem, the poetry text that they gave you. Now, I'm going to read it aloud. You don't have to read it aloud, but in your head, you should be doing this, right? The fish, wade through black jade of the crow blue mussel shells, one keeps adjusting the ash heaps, opening and shutting itself like an injured fan. The barnacles which encrust the side of the wave cannot hide, there for the submerged shafts of the sun, split like spun glass, move themselves with spotlight swiftness into the crevicles, in and out, illuminating. And there's a lot more, okay? There's a lot more, but I've only included the first three passages because this question is actually about the title of the poem. Now, reading the poem aloud, think about the images that it creates, okay? What images does it create? It creates a bit of a seascape. We see the sunlight coming down into the ocean. We see barnacles. We see fish and mussels floating about. And we see, the sun going into little cracks into the rocks. And we feel, we feel very calm. Okay, we feel like we're going into a new world. Those are the things you should be focusing on. And if you read a poem like that, this question here should actually be quite easy. Because remember, you're not finding a fact. All right? The poet is not going to tell you, I have titled the poem The Fish in order to create this effect, right? That would be stupid. Yeah. But if we focus on the imagery and we focus on the moods, what does the title of the fish do? What does it create in our mind? Now let's read this first stanza again. The fish wade through the black jade of the crow blue mussel shells. One keeps adjusting the ash heaps, opening and shutting itself like an injured fan. So let's look at the answers that we have. Does it prepare us for the important last line? Well, unfortunately, I haven't attached the last line here, but if we look at those of you who have the answer the book in front of you, the last line is, the sea grows old in it. The fish, the sea grows old in it. Don't really see a connection there, right? What does the fish have to do with that? Not really anything, so it's probably not A. Contrast with the overall theme. Now, while you're reading this, remember what I just said? It creates a landscape of the sea, creates all these images of the sea, things floating about. Does the fish contrast with that? Yes or no? No, Doesn't, right? Because we're creating a landscape of the sea. A fish fits perfectly in the landscape of the sea, so obviously it can't be contrasting against the overall theme. Now, what if the title was the MacBook Pro? If the title was the MacBook Pro, that would be a really weird title, and that would contrast with the overall theme, right? Because this poem is about a seascape, but the title is the MacBook Pro. So that would have nothing to do with the poem. So that would be right if the title was the MacBook Pro. Unfortunately, the title is The Fish. Does it actually refer to a person? Now, reading this poem, do we think this is about a metaphor? Is the whole poem like a symbolism for someone, walking down the street? Not really. It seems to be very obviously about fish and barnacles and the sea and the waves and things like that. So it doesn't seem to be about an actual person. Therefore, even if we don't get the right answer, we have filtered out all the wrong answers and we led to the answer D. So D is the right answer. But why is D the right answer? How does this lead us into the poem itself? Well, it leads us into the poem because the fish is a symbol of the sea. Okay, when we think of the sea, we think of fish. And guess what? What's the first line in the poem? Wade. Okay, wade, which means swim. Okay, so we think of a fish. The fish swims through black jade, right? It wades through black jade. So it kind of leads us into the poem itself. So that's why D is the most correct answer. And that's why D is the right answer for this question. But does everyone see how when you're reading a poem, you have to focus on things that are not facts? You're not going to get many facts from a poem. You're not going to learn that silicon is used for computer chips and stuff like that, right? You're not going to learn hard scientific facts like you might do in an article, or you might not learn someone's opinion. But you need to focus on the imagery, the moods, the tones, and the emotion. What sorts of feelings does it create? And that will lead you to your answer. Does everyone feel a little bit more confident about poems now? Hopefully. Okay, let's move on to the third one. Now, the third category of question, you need to be very careful. Now, there's a lot of writing on the page because it's not a complex type of question, but one where all my practice students, the students who I know who did this exam, they sometimes lost 5 marks in this section. Okay, in this one passage, which is only 8 questions or maybe even 6 questions, they got 4 out of 6 wrong. Now that's really bad. Now why is that bad? Because there's only 30 questions in the exam. When there's only 30 questions, what happens? If you get 4 wrong, that's a huge chunk of the exam. So this is one where we have to use a clever strategy to ensure that we get it accurate. Now, what is this strategy and what is the fill in the blank type question? The fill in the blank type question is one, it's a completely new type of comprehension exercise that we haven't seen tested before. It is not difficult, okay? Don't think, oh, fill in the blank, I'm gonna fail. No, you're not gonna fail, you're gonna do well, but there is a risk attached to this kind of question. And the risk is, as we were talking about before, a kind of butterfly effect. So let me remind you what a butterfly effect is again. A butterfly effect is when you get something wrong, you might get other things wrong along with it. This is the only type of question where there could be a disastrous butterfly effect. And the reason for that is, what is the nature of this type of passage? This type of passage will give you a prose text where they've gotten a knife and they've cut out a bunch of sentences, okay? It's going to be blanks in the middle of paragraphs, they've cut it out. Then they're going to give you 8 sentences, maybe more, and there's only going to be 6 questions. And you have to fill in the most appropriate sentence for each blank. Now, can everyone see why there might be a butterfly effect now? Because if you use the wrong sentence for one of the blanks that was meant for another one, what are you going to do for the other one? You're going to use the wrong sentence as well. So every time you make a mistake, you're potentially making 2. And every time you make 2, you're potentially making 3. And every time you make 3, you make 4 or 5, and then, you get the whole section wrong and it's a big disaster, right? So we must be really careful because it's a little bit risky rushing through this. As long as we take our time and we go through things very carefully, we should be able to get this type of passage 100% correct. Remember, this is not a difficult challenge. It's not actually asking you to answer difficult questions. It's just asking you, what is missing from this paragraph? What is missing from this paragraph? Now, what is important? The important strategy is two things. Okay, we're going to talk very briefly about the strategy of solving this type of question. Now, remember my 3 general tips from the beginning of approaching the reading section. The first general tip is what? To always read through the answers. You need to skim read the answers very quickly to get a good idea of, okay, what are the puzzle pieces that I have to make this puzzle? What you don't want to do is shove a random puzzle piece into the wrong place. Who's been doing like a large, 300-piece puzzle before and they just can't find the right puzzle piece for the spot? Now, if you've had that experience, it's like a similar thing here. If you rush through it and you don't read the questions first to know what puzzle pieces you have, you might accidentally shove the wrong puzzle piece into the wrong spot, and then you're going to cause a butterfly effect. So always read the answers first. Now, second of all, there's going to be a sentence missing from several paragraphs. When you read that paragraph, get your pencil out and make a note of what that paragraph is roughly about. So in the next passage, the practice example, we're going to be looking at a passage about octopi. So the octopus, okay? Very strange sea creatures. Now, when we read this passage about the octopus, you're going to realize that each of the paragraphs are about slightly different things. One of them might be about farming and, getting octopi for food. Another might be about the ink of an octopus. A third paragraph might be about experiments conducted on an octopus. Does that make sense? So we're going to be dealing with all these different types of paragraphs which all have a specific focus. Now make a quick note, you don't have to spend a lot of time on this, and make sure you know what each paragraph is asking. And the third and the most key tip, everyone, please remember, is you have to do the questions out of order. There is no way of doing it anywhere else. If you don't do the questions out of order, you are at a much higher chance of getting it totally wrong. And the reason for that is, if you do them in the order that they're given, how do you know what's coming up next? How do you know there's not a better blank for what you just put? Does that make sense? Let's say I have a puzzle piece and I put it into the blank. How do you know that the question three paragraphs down is not a better place for that paragraph, for that sentence that you've just put in? So you do the questions out of order. And what you do is this. You look at all the questions and you look at all your puzzle pieces and you think, okay, which ones am I 100% sure of? What do I have without a shadow of a doubt? Okay, this sentence definitely fits here. You do all of those first, and then you gradually filter out the ones that don't belong. Does that make sense to everyone? And this is going to make more sense when we look at the practice example. You do the ones that are 100% sure first. You look at the paragraphs and you think, okay, what is missing here? Oh, a sentence about octopuses in a science experiment. Okay, which one of these puzzle pieces is about an octopus in a science experiment? You put it in, you have a read of the paragraph, you think, okay, is that correct? Does that make sense? If it does, you put it in first. You cannot do these questions 1 through to 10 in a regular order because you have no idea whether an answer you put at the start might be not better for a question that's later on. Now, the difficulty about the fill in the blank section is there are sometimes sentences that seem to fit for multiple spaces. And this is what's really annoying, right? There's a sentence that sort of fits in 3 or 4 different spaces. However, there's always going to be a space where it's the most appropriate, the most right. That's why we have to do them out of order. We find the ones that we're sure of and certain of first, and then we only have a couple of left over, and then we only have to pick from the remaining puzzle pieces. So this is like, for example, what's one strategy of doing a puzzle? What do you do first? You always start from the corners and the edges, right? Who's done a big puzzle before, right? It's impossible to start from the middle because how do you know what piece is in the middle? You have no idea where the little knob is coming out, right? So you always start from the corners and from the edges. This is the same principle. You don't do a puzzle from inside out, right? That doesn't make any sense. You do a puzzle from outside in. So you start with the ones you're sure of first. And which ones are we sure of? The corner pieces. That's why we have to do it out of order. Does everyone understand that basic principle? All right, now let's look at what the question actually looks like. So on the left is going to be your passage. As you can see here, there's a sentence missing from every paragraph. That's not the first paragraph, right? Now there's more questions than this. On the right are going to be several different sentences. You have to fill in each sentence into a blank. But the unfortunate part is what? You can't use a sentence more than once, right? And it would be a bit weird if the author wrote the same exact sentence multiple times in a passage, right? That would be bad writing, unless it's poetry, where you can repeat yourself, okay? So each puzzle piece on the right should only be used once, okay? And the really annoying part is, if everyone has this open, there's an extra sentence in there. There's one that doesn't belong anywhere, and that's the challenge, okay? You have how many spots? You have 6 spots, and you have 7 puzzle pieces. One belongs to a totally different puzzle. It's not even part of this puzzle. So that's why we have to do the ones we're 100% certain of first. Now, let's have a quick read. I'm going to give you maybe 2 or 3 minutes to have a look at the passage on the right. Now, in my opinion, one of these 3 spots is 100% certain, more clear than the other 2. One of these spots is more certain than the others. So which one should we do first, and what is the right puzzle piece for that spot? As everyone sees here, there's 15, 16, 17. I think one of these is more certain than the others. So have a quick read now, 2 or 3 minutes. Look at your options on the right. These are your answers. Look at your puzzle piece spots on the left. Which one of these 3 seems more certain? Oh, I know that one fits there. That's like a corner piece in a puzzle. Okay, have a bit of time now to have a figure out for yourself. Don't worry if you can't get all 3, because you obviously don't have the whole passage, right? So don't worry if you can't get all 3, as long as you try to get one of them. Does that make sense? Because you kind of need the whole passage to get all of them. Okay, 1 more minute. I think everyone should hopefully see what I mean. Okay, which one of these 3 seems like, ooh, yeah, okay, that one seems most correct. I'm certain of that one. Okay, so let's have a look at the spaces that we have and the answers that we have. Now, in my opinion, and you can disagree with me because obviously this is down to opinion and down to personal preference, but I think number 16 is the most clear. That's the one we can get for certain. Now, number 15 and 17, there might be multiple sentences that fit into that space. Does that make sense? A couple of the sentences sort of fit in okay. There's not one that is definitely 100% correct. Now, why is 16 certain? Because 16 is about what? This paragraph here. This paragraph seems to be about octopuses using tools. Okay, they're smart enough to use tools. Now, none of these sentences here, apart from E, are about octopuses using tools, right? Because sentence E is, in one such experiment, scientists observed octopuses building shelters from pieces of coconut shell. That's about octopuses using tools because they're very smart, right? But the other ones don't really seem to have anything to do with that, which means we can be 100% certain that that's the sentence that fits into that spot. Now, once we fit that into the spot, we've removed one puzzle piece from the equation. Does that make sense? We're making the passage easier for us to do. Now, what did some students do wrong? They started with 15, okay? And they looked at 15, and unfortunately, there's lots of answers that seem to be quite appropriate when it comes to 15, right? So what is this second paragraph, about? The researchers say that farming octopuses would require the catching of vast amounts of fish and shellfish to feed them, putting further pressure on the planet's already threatened marine livestock. The group, led by Professor Jennifer Jackett of New York University, argues that octopuses are highly developed and curious creatures. Blank. We can see no reason why in the 21st century a sophisticated, complex animal should become the source of mass-produced food. Now, what would happen? Some people read that and they put the answer F. Now, if we look at the answer F, it looks kind of appropriate, right? Because it's about not making octopuses for food. Does that make sense? And what's the immediate sentence afterwards? It's this professor, Jennifer Jackett, arguing against farming, right? So lots of people put F. They were like, yes, this answer is very, very obvious. It's F. But the case for octopus farming is weak, according to Jackett and her co-authors. Does everyone see how that maybe sort of works? Yeah, kind of sort of works there. Now, what's the problem with that? That's not the right answer. The answer for this question, surprisingly enough, okay, is what? Does anyone actually know? The answer for this question, the most intensive one, okay, is actually probably C, when you actually go through the rest of them, right? And that's what the answer is for this particular question. And unfortunately, it's actually C, which is really surprising, right? But that's the most appropriate one once you filter out the rest. And that's not going to be immediately obvious for you, okay? Put up your hand if maybe you got lucky, put C as the answer for 15 on your first try. Some people did, but a lot of students didn't. Now, what's the problem here? You've used the incorrect puzzle piece here, but now you're missing that puzzle piece. And can everyone see how the butterfly effect happens? You get 15 wrong, and then for another question, you actually need to use F or C or something like that. And then you get that one wrong as well because you've already eliminated that one, so you have to use another puzzle piece. And then you end up getting a puzzle piece that doesn't look like the Mona Lisa, but it looks like a child's drawing of the Mona Lisa because it's all scrambled, right? Does everyone see what I mean? We have to do these questions out of order. Put up your hand if you understand what I mean and what the danger is of doing it in order. Because when you do it like 15, 16, 17, you get too ahead of yourself. You rush and you put the wrong one for 15, which causes you to put another wrong one. Now, the answer for questions is actually 15 is actually C, but it wouldn't be obvious on first look, right? Let's look at 17 as well. The answer for question 17 is actually A. But that's not immediately obvious either. Now, some of you might have put A immediately, but it's not as obvious as 16. Now, put your hand up if you agree. 16 is pretty clearly only one answer. There's really only one spot that can go there, right? Because the other ones don't have anything to do with octopuses using tools and being smart. So that's why we have to put in the answers that we're 100% certain of first. We put in E there, and maybe we go to question, 20 first, and we think, okay, what goes in question 20? And we do that one first. And then we go back up to 18, and we think, okay, maybe 18 is obvious now from the answers that I have left. Now, remember, the best way to not make a silly error, 粗心 error, when you're doing these questions is you have to get your paper out, and what do? You write in pencil first. You get this little passage and you fill out C, B, A, F in here first before you write them on your answer key. That way, when you finally finish the entire passage, all you have to do is fill in everything that you've written. You're much less likely to make a silly mistake. Now, that's an even worse mistake, right? Who hates the feeling of making a silly mistake, knowing they could have gotten the question right, but they just like, oh, I counted the one wrong. I put the answer 15 in the 14 box. That's the worst, right? Now, to avoid that kind of mistake, which becomes more likely when we do the questions out of order, we use pencil and we write on the exam booklet first. Every time we use a puzzle piece, we cross it out, right? We know, okay, we can't really use that one anymore. That one's been eliminated. One final tip is after you've filled in all the boxes, go through and check. You have time. Remember, you have 30 questions, 40 minutes, which means you have more than enough time to go through and check. Ask yourself, hey, do I have all the puzzle pieces in the spots that they fit the best? Maybe after you check, you realize, these two seem to be better when they're swapped around. Always go through a final check at the end. Okay, now let's move on to the final type of question. Whoops. The final type of question in the reading exam is called passage identification. In my opinion, passage identification is, once again, not that hard. It's actually quite simple when you get down to it. However, it also requires you to be very accurate. Now, passage identification is a little bit annoying. Why is it annoying? You will get up to 4 passages, 4 different things to read. Okay, so for the first one, comparative reading, you only had 2. But for this one, we need 4. Luckily for you, though, they're not very long. Okay, so they're only usually 1 or 2 paragraphs long, these smaller passages. But you'll have 4 different ones, and they're all from different authors. Now, they're all going to be about the same topic. In the exam, they were about dreams. You might get another one about airplanes or, I don't know, drums or something like that. But they're all going to be roughly about the same topic. Then you'll have a series of statements. And you have to match A, B, C, or D out of the 4 extracts. Which one of these extracts fits the statement the best? Now, luckily for you, there's no chance of creating a butterfly effect in this question. That's only for fill in the blank. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that aspect. But the tricky part about passage identification questions is what? There may be multiple passages that kind of sort of fits with a statement. Does that make sense? Multiple passages which kind of work with a statement. But remember, you have to ask yourself, which is the best passage? Not the one that kind of sort of fits, the one that you think, yes, that I have a level of certainty to it. I feel confident in my answer. I feel like that is the best passage. That's the one you should go for. Now, my key tip for tackling the passage identification section is, when you're reading each individual passage, A, B, and C, and D, get out a pencil and write down what the main argument and idea in each of those passages is. Remember, they're all going to be about one topic, okay? They're all going to be about dreams, for example, in the sample exam. One of the passages might be about dreams in one aspect, another might be about dreams in another aspect. What you don't want to do is this, and this is the key danger to passage identification questions. Listen very closely. Lots of my students ran out of time in this exam. And you might be thinking to yourself, how is that possible? You only have 30 questions, but you have 40 minutes. They ran out of time because what they do is this, okay? They read a question, 21, and then they reread A through to D. They're going to read every question, every passage 4 times. You do not want to read 40 passages, okay? You don't want to read the same 4 passages 10 times. You don't want to read the passage again and again and again and again and again for every question. So you have to work smart. Every time you read the passage, you write down a couple of notes by the side in pencil. What was this passage kind of about? What was it arguing about dreams? And that way, you don't have to reread it that super carefully and waste a lot of time. Does that make sense? If you work smart and you make notes first, you don't have to reread all 4 passages, which is a huge waste of time. Instead, you should be working smart and making notes. That way, you understand, hey, what is the difference between A, B, and C, and D? How are they arguing things a bit differently? Remember, every single extract in this passage identification section will be arguing things a little bit differently. Now, the distinctions might be subtle. They might not be like for and against. They might be for, but in one aspect, and against in another aspect. So you have to be careful. Make notes by the side so you don't have to spend a lot of time, wasting a lot of time rereading. So let's move on to what the question actually looks like. Here's our practice example. On the left, we have the series of statements. Okay, so there's going to be a series of statements. You have to choose A, B, C, or D. Okay, which of these statements most fits? Which of these statements most fits? Now, what we're going to do is this, and I'm going to give you a little bit more time to do this, is have a read at extract C and D. Okay, have a read of extract C and D. And let's try to figure out if we can match some of these to the questions, to the statements. Okay, so have a few minutes now, 2 or 3. Let's just focus on the first few. Okay, 21 through to 24. Let's just look at 21 through to 24. Don't look all the way down to 30. It's a bit of a hint already, okay? But do passages C or D match any of the statements in 21 through to 24? Remember, you can only put one answer in each box. So read extract C and D now. Make a quick note. What is each extract kind of saying? What's its main argument? Remember, each passage can be used multiple times. So there might be several of these statements which are about C. There might even be an extract which is not referred to at all. Does that make sense to everyone? Maybe extract C is none of the answers. That's a possibility. Okay, so this is why we need to get clear in our heads what each of the extracts is about. What's its main argument? What is it trying to say? Okay, take a quick minute now to read it. I'm just going to quickly close my window because the crickets are getting a little bit loud. 1 second. Okay, 1 more minute. 21 through to 24. Do any of these statements seem to match the passages C and D? Whoops. Oh, what happened? Can people still see that? Sorry. Oh, my bad. Okay, I think I accidentally canceled the share screen. Sorry about that. We should be able to see it again. Okay, 30 more seconds. 21 through to 24. Do any of these passages seem to match? Okay, let's look at these two passages now and try to figure out what some of the main ideas are, because this is also a trap. Remember, like I said, several of the passages might seem to match one of the extracts the most well. But that doesn't mean that it's the right answer. So let's read through extract C together. One morning when I was younger, I gave a detailed description of my previous night's dream to my mother. When I finished, she said, "I'm going to tell you something. Don't ever share your dreams with anyone. It's boring to listen to other people's dreams." I was offended at first, but of course she was right. It's almost always deadly to hear other people talk about their dreams. As a rule, dreams die in the glare of the waking world, their shimmering aura evaporating in the harsh air outside the psyche. And yet, paradoxically, it's the emotional aura of dreams that makes them feel so urgently worth sharing in the first place. I still share my dreams, just not verbally. Like so many other writers and artists too, I employ dreams in my creative work. They're an engine, a lending library. It's a thrill to wake with a strange, arresting image in mind, or still grasping the thread of an allegorical dream story. So let's look at these 4 things. Now remember, the strategy for doing this type of question is which extract best fits. Now looking at 21 through to 24, some people might have put extract C for 23 and 24? Because it's kind of sort of slightly right. Does that make sense? It kind of feels like, yeah, maybe possibly. But unfortunately, I didn't attach all the extracts. But if we had read the other extracts, we would have seen that the other passages fit 23 and 24 better. Does this one really talk about something impossible in a dream? Not really. Kind of. Maybe it's like a surreal because it says strange image. Maybe you think, oh, maybe it's about that, but not really, right? What is the main idea of this passage? It's about a writer who uses dreams in their writing. So which one of these statements feels like the most appropriate? 22. Okay, 22 seems to grasp at the main idea of extract C. Does that make sense to everyone? 22 refers to using dreams as a source of professional inspiration. And the person writing this extract seems like a professional writer. Like many other writers and artists, I employ dreams in my creative work. So that one clearly grasped at the main idea, not just sort of slightly. Does that make sense? If something is only sort of slightly a tiny bit relevant, look at the other extracts. Is there a more relevant one? If there isn't, then you can fill that in. Does that make sense to everyone? You always have to find the best passage for the answer. If it's only very tiny bit relevant and you're not sure, look at the other 3 extracts first. Is there a better one? If there isn't, hey, maybe you have the right answer. But more often than not, you're going to find that you don't. Now let's look at extract D. For the first time in a long while, I had a dream which I feel like writing down. This was a dream where I was auditioning for an acting job and the dream went lucid. I realized that what was going on was a dream. So as I often do in these auditions, I chilled out and tried not to actively do anything. I often like just to see what the dream reveals. A nondescript person came up to me and handed me a small white book with gold lettering. Remember this book, said the person, because when you wake up, you're going to want to get a copy. Really remember it, and so on and so forth. Now looking at 21 through to 24 again. Maybe some of you think, oh, yeah, okay, maybe 24 is about D. But is extract D really about teaching us something useful? Not really, right? We're reading it and it seems to be, oh, okay, he gets a Batman book. It doesn't really seem to be like, this is very useful information for my life. Which one of these seems most appropriate? 21 seems to be really grasping at the main idea of extract D. Okay, 21. Why? Because extract D is about being aware that I'm dreaming, right? Isn't that the whole point? Oh, I suddenly realize I'm in a lucid dream. It's not really about teaching us something useful. And it's not really about doing something impossible that we can't do in real life. Because obviously you could, someone could come up to you and recommend a Batman book in real life, right? It's not really about that. So really, 21 is grasping at the main idea. And this is why it's so important when you're doing and identifying the passage question. When you're reading the extracts, always make a little note. What is this passage really about? What is the main idea of this passage? What are some of the themes of this passage? If you get clear how the passages are different, you should be able to score 100% in this section. And guess what? You should be able to speed through this section, okay? If you're really accurate, you should look at this section, you should think, thank the heavens, 10 free marks, right? Because it's not really asking you to answer very complex questions. It's just asking you to identify, hey, which of these statements is the most closest to any of these 4 passages? It's actually not that hard, but you must be accurate. It's really easy to get a mistake here, but it's not actually that difficult to come up with the answer, as long as you're accurate and you work smart. Okay, that wraps up our reading section. I'm going to talk very, very quickly now about the writing section because I've been talking now for almost an hour and a half and I'm very thirsty. So let's move on. How was the writing section changed? Now, when the writing section sample exam came out, I had so many students coming to me and saying, oh, Chewy, the world is over. The writing question, it's not persuasive or creative. What do I do? It's a weird text. They're asking me to write an advice sheet. They're asking me to write a letter. Oh my God, I've never learned how to write a letter. What do I do, Chewy? Now, the key to the writing section is it hasn't really changed at all. Nothing's really changed. The only thing that's changed is how they ask you to write the question. Every time you write a piece of writing in the selective exam, you still have to use a structure. You can't just start ranting. You can't just start, oh, well, yes, hello, my name is Chewy, and then you start writing some random stuff, right? You can't start writing free-form poetry and jazz, and you can't start writing song lyrics, okay? Just because it asks you to write an advice sheet or a letter or a recommendation or something like that, or a poster, doesn't mean you can just be like, oh, I'm going to write poetry, free-form, whatever I like. I'm just going to start writing in a rant. Do not panic. That's actually my key tip for the writing section. Do not panic. Doesn't matter if you haven't seen the exact form, you're still very likely to write some sort of persuasive text. Now, they might ask you to write it in the form of an advice sheet. They might ask you to write it in the form of a letter, but that doesn't mean that you don't use a persuasive structure. Does that make sense? There is no special right structure for a letter. Now, you might have to change a few things, and I'll talk about that later, but for the most part, you still use everything that you have learned about persuasive writing and the structure of persuasive writing. Now, I don't have the time to go through an entire persuasive writing course with you guys. So either you can learn it by yourself or you can take a class on it with us, but you still use a persuasive writing structure. If you accidentally start writing in a free-form jazz, you're going to lose marks, okay? If they say write an advice sheet and you start writing, oh, hello, my name is Chewy and this is my advice. And then you start writing number 1, my advice. Okay, you're going to lose marks, okay? They're going to be like, what is this nonsense? I can't even make head or tail of this, okay? So the only thing that's changed in the writing section is the way the question's phrased. You're still more than likely having to write a persuasive writing piece. Now, you might be asked to write a short story and then you just write a creative, right? But more than likely, you're going to be asked to write some sort of persuasive piece, but it might not look like a persuasive question. Does that make sense? So what's a persuasive question look like? You know, oh, that school uniform should be banned. But just because the question doesn't look like a persuasive question doesn't mean you don't use a persuasive structure. That structure is useful for any text where you're trying to convince someone of something, argue something. Just because you're not answering a question that looks like that school uniform should be banned doesn't mean that you don't try to convince someone of something. Anytime you're convincing someone of something or anything like that, even if you're writing a letter, right, you still use a persuasive structure in an exam. So let's look at the question they gave us. This is what all my students were panicking about. They're like, oh, I don't know what to do. Do I have to write a creative? Oh. Okay, look. 3 students have just arrived in your local area. Your teacher has asked you to write an advice sheet for them, making them feel enthusiastic about coming to your school. Write an advice sheet for the new students about how to get on well in your school and local area. Now, some people looked at this question and they started panicking. They were like, this is not a persuasive text. I don't know how to answer this question. Oh my God. But what do we know now? Just because it doesn't look like a debating topic doesn't mean you don't use a persuasive structure. What is the question actually asking you to do? Right? It's asking you to give advice. You're persuading someone still. So use all the same structures and techniques that you're used to. It doesn't matter what it looks like, everyone. This is my key advice. Still stick to a structure. Still have an introduction, body paragraphs, and conclusion. Don't start writing free form. If you start writing free form, you're going to lose marks. Now, how might we apply this? Okay, we're still using a persuasive structure for our introduction. Okay, so we might open with a hook. Feeling anxious and alone because you've just moved school? There is no need for your worries. This advice sheet will provide you with a few key tips to acclimatize to the area and your new place of study. First, blah, 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 blah. Does everyone see how this is just like a persuasive structure? Yeah? Just like the start of a persuasive essay, right? Except you're just changing the framing a little bit. You're just changing a little bit of how it's presented. Okay? Instead of saying in this essay or in this argument, you're saying in this advice sheet. It's still a persuasive structure. You can't just start writing random nonsense about, oh, by the way, you should come to the canteen and hang out with me or something, right? Oh, the cookies are really good. Come try the cookies at the canteen. Like, no, right? You still have to use a persuasive structure. If you start writing free form, you're going to lose marks. Now, same with the introduction, you still use a body paragraph structure, right? You might say something like, the first piece of advice is to involve yourself in any clubs, societies, or activities that you find interesting. And then you just keep writing a body paragraph like normal. And then your second body paragraph might be, our second piece of advice is to blah, blah, blah. Finally, you write a conclusion, just like a persuasive essay. Now, you don't call it a persuasive writing. You don't call it a persuasive essay. What do you call it? You call it an advice sheet because that's what they've asked you to call it. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, do not panic. That's actually my key tip, is don't panic. I know that's seemingly a very obvious tip, but so many students panicked when they saw this. And even though you have 30 minutes, by the way, writing only used to be 20 minutes, so you have more time now. Writing only used to be 20 minutes in the selective. Now you have 30 minutes. You have more time to write now, so don't panic. Take it slow and write it like a piece of persuasive writing. Use a structure, come up with 2 or 3 body paragraphs and make sure they're detailed. Now in 30 minutes, I would probably recommend writing 3 body paragraphs. Okay, I would recommend writing 3 because you have more time now. But do not panic when you see the question. Don't think, oh my God, I don't recognize this. Do not panic. You're always going to use some sort of structure. If in doubt, and it's not obviously a creative, use a persuasive structure. For example, another one might be, okay, this is one that I've seen before in a practice exam. If you were the Prime Minister of Australia, what would you change about the country? Lots of people saw that and they were like, oh no, it's not a persuasive. What do I do? It's not about school uniforms getting banned. But what do? You do the same thing, right? You start with a hook. Australia is a lucky country, but unfortunately, there are a few areas that are still letting it down. And then you go into your body paragraphs, right? Firstly, I would change the, refugee policy of Australia or something like that, right? You still step through a persuasive structure and you end with a conclusion. There's nothing different. Just because the question's phrased differently doesn't mean you have to panic. Always stick to a structure. Does everyone understand the key takeaway of the new writing section? Don't panic, stick to a structure. Okay, my throat is very hoarse, but we finished the substantial